Ladies and gentlemen, this is the 12th and final round.
Right hand, Golovkin steps in and down he goes again. Unbelievable. Mayweather makes a pay. What a rookie mistake. A sensational left hook by De La Hoya.
It's facts. I'm the best. You know what I mean? Sometimes I don't want to believe it myself, but it's the truth. I'm the best. I'm going to show you how great I am.
From Southern California, this is the Last Round Podcast.
Welcome to another bonus show of the Last Round Podcast. And today we have author of Believe the Hype, Bundini, Todd D. Snyder. Thanks for joining me, Todd.
Hey, thank you, Michael. I appreciate it.
I even planned a special T-shirt, which obviously, with it being a podcast, is no good for people. But it's a float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, Muhammad Ali T-shirt, ready for the interview.
Yeah, that's perfect. Coined by my man, Drew Bundini Brown. That's his most famous lyric, right?
See all the planning that went into this interview?
Oh, yeah, you got the ensemble and everything. You look great, man.
All right, just jump straight into it, Todd. So just tell us your background. You know, obviously you grew up around boxing for people that know you.
Yeah, I grew up, my father, his name was Michael Snyder. He was a boxing trainer in West Virginia, and he ran a series of gyms during my childhood and teenage years. So I was one of those kids who grew up the son of a boxing trainer. So my adolescence was spent in boxing gyms. He mostly trained amateurs, you know, sort of a community outreach for troubled kids in the community to keep them out of trouble, keep them away from bad influences that might otherwise send them down the wrong path. So I grew up around boxing my whole life. When I was in high school, I boxed for a little bit. And then when I went off to college, that sort of ended my box career. But I would come home in the summers and during breaks and work corners with my father and, help him out down at the gym. So, one of the reasons I was drawn to writing Bundini's life story was that, I've always been fascinated by trainers and sort of the psychological makeup of boxing and what it means to go through a training camp and the different spokes in the wheel that make a training camp go. That's sort of the story of my childhood. And my dad's hero was Ali. So I was always fascinated by the guy. And I was always interested in, the impact trainers and even entourages have on fighters. And you think of Ali had the most famous entourage of all time. And Bundini may have been the most charismatic member of that entourage. I was drawn to the story for two reasons. One, I'm the son of a boxing trainer. Two, I'm just fascinated by the psychological aspect of boxing. I know Teddy Atlas talks about it a lot. Much of boxing is mental. Mm-hmm. And I would watch kids in my dad's gym have all the talent in the world and lose a fight in the locker room. Then I would see kids who had all the heart but not the talent. My dad would sort of pull them to the finish line. So I've always been fascinated by guys like Bundini. How do you motivate someone who's a savant? How do you motivate someone who's not just great but labeled the greatest of all time? And I've been a Bundini fan ever since I was a kid. I just thought he was interesting. I've always been fascinated by that poet laureate in Ali's corner. And I think my childhood was the reason I was drawn to him as a subject.
And you have an interesting story about how you actually came to, write the book.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm an English professor, and I teach here in New York, and I teach a class on hip hop history. And it's not the only class I teach, but it's certainly the most popular, the one that fills up the fastest. And I've been teaching this for a while, about a decade now. And the course was really popular, so we decided to do an event we call Hip Hop Week. It's a week-long celebration, all the core elements of the culture. And we got some funds together through a cross-cultural solidarity initiative that my school has. And we decided for the first ever Hip Hop Week, we would bring in Grandmaster Flash. Then the next year, we brought in Chuck D, a Public Enemy. And what's interesting about those two guys is Grandmaster Flash, his name is Joseph Sadler. He's related to Sandy Sadler, the great fighter. And Chuck D was the narrator of that Ali rap documentary. So every time these guys come to my campus and meet my students, we end up talking hip hop and boxing. And my students were asking Chuck D about that Ali rap documentary that he narrated for ESPN. And one of my students said, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. Isn't that the first ever, rap lyric? And he said, sure, if you want to say Ali's the first rapper, I have no problem with that whatsoever. And then I piped in during lunch and I said, well, if Ali's the first rapper, then Bundini's the first hype man. And I was sort of alluding to Flavor, his, Chuck D's hype man and Public Enemy. And I'll never forget it. Chuck said to me, somebody should write a book on Bundini. He kind of gets overlooked. And he gets overlooked in Ali Rap, the documentary that Chuck's a part of. They don't even talk about Bundini. He coined that phrase. And I started thinking about it. All the great Ali books that have been written, there's so many. Usually Bundini gets a paragraph or maybe a couple pages. And, the idea sort of in my head by Chuck D of Public Enemy, who said to me, someone should write this story on Bundini because he was sort of hip hop before there was such a thing.
And then I believe, was it the Hamilton Car Publications posted something about Bundini, and then they were looking for somebody to write a documentary. Yeah, I mean, the first step of it was me meeting Chuck D and him kind of putting that idea in my head, that germ of an idea. But what happened was that was a couple years, like 2014. So fast forward a couple years, Hamilton Car Publications is a boxing-based publisher out of Boston, and they have a website where they have all these really talented boxing writers blog for them. And Kyle Serafine, who was one of the principal publishers, did a blog arguing that Bundini was the greatest hype man in sports history. And I guess the blog got a lot of traffic. A lot of people were commenting and sharing it on Facebook and, Twitter. And they started immediately after they saw the interest in that blog, looking for someone who could write this story. And Kyle, from a very early point on, thought to himself, well, we need a guy who understands hip hop too, someone who knows boxing and hip hop. And so he Googled boxing hip hop writer. And apparently I came up pictures of me and Chuck D and Grandmaster Flash and these guys. Because, as I write about boxing, I also write about hip hop. I sort of have a foot in both worlds, just like Bundini did. I think Bundini's a part of hip hop history. I think he's also a part of boxing history. And they found me. We had a conference call. They hooked me up with Bundini's son, Drew Brown III. We got to know each other a little bit. I flew down to Atlanta. And once I got down there and got to meet the Brown family, we realized we had something. So we started working. Just give us a bit of a background on Bundini. Where did he grow up? And then obviously one of the questions everyone's going to be wondering is, where did the name Bundini come from? His life story is so amazing. And it's been written about incorrectly in so many different high-profile Ali books. He gets labeled as a Harlem cat because, we know Bundini as coming out of Harlem, and we know that he worked with Sugar Ray. We see Bundini in those Shaft movies. He's Willie, that gangster from Harlem. So a lot of times that's how we see him, as this sort of Harlem guy. But he grew up in Sanford, Florida. And Sanford was the celery capital of the United States of America at the time. So all of his family worked, really tough jobs out in the citrus groves, the celery fields, doing backbreaking work out in that Florida heat. And he grew up in a real poor family. And in a lot of ways, it was a traumatic childhood. His dad was an alcoholic. His dad was very abusive. His dad was a hard, macho kind of guy. This is at a time period where, we had Jim Crow laws in America where black men didn't have the same rights as white people. And his mother abandoned him when he was a kid. There was just this chain of traumatic stuff that happened to him. And that leads up to him as a teenager lying about his age and joining the Navy just to get out of those circumstances. So he lies about his age and they take him on in the Navy. Essentially, he was a steward. He peeled potatoes, cooked in the kitchen, was a servant to the officers. He gets kicked out of the Navy after an incident with an officer. They find out he's not 18 years old. So he joins the Merchant Marines. So his teenage years, early 20s, he's out of the water. He's a nomadic guy. He's just out living wherever, Well, that journey, the Merchant Marines eventually lands him in Harlem, where he hooks up with Johnny Honeyboy Bratton, hooks up with Sugar Ray Robinson, and that's his gateway into the fight game. But as you mentioned, the nickname Bundini has nothing to do with boxing. When he was in the Navy, he was at a port in India, and they had a torpedo malfunction on the ship. And the stewards on the ship got to go explore the docks for a couple hours. Apparently, some girls thought he was handsome. He had a bow tie and a nice suit on. So they started hollering Bundini, Bundini at him, which, based on what I've learned, roughly translates to lover. It's sort of a cat call kind of thing.
So the officers heard the girls hollering at him like that. So they started calling him Bundini Brown. So that was his nickname for the rest of the tour, is Bundini Brown for the rest of the time he was in the Navy. So you're right. The nickname has nothing to do with boxing. He got that during the Navy.
So doing research, obviously, for the interview, is it Bundini or Bodini?
You're asking the right question. Here's what his son taught me. If you were a part of the Muhammad Ali entourage, they said Bodini. Ali had that Louisville, Kentucky accent, so he pronounced it Bodini. But if you go by the spelling of the word, it's pronounced Bundini. Mm-hmm. But his son taught me that if you knew his father and you were a part of the inner circle, he can always tell someone who knew his dad because they call him Bodini. So I try to say it that way, even though I do feel like I knew his father, because I got to know the family so well. I guess, either way, it depends on how close you are to the great Muhammad Ali. If you're part of the team, Bodini. If you're the rest of us, Bundini.
Did you ever think about putting Bodini on the cover?
Well, I didn't want to go against the way it's spelled in every publication. I mean, Sports Illustrated, Ring Magazine. I'm sure the spelling that Bundini used wasn't correct. It's not the way it's probably spelled in Hindi at all. So I'm sure the spelling was incorrect to start with, but it was such a fantastic name. It sounds like a magician or something. It's flashy, cool name. Of course, he had a bunch of nicknames. When he was in Harlem, they called him Fast Black. When he was in the streets hustling, they called him the Black Prince. He had a bunch of nicknames. He would tell you a different version of where that came from, depending on who he was talking to. So we spelled it the way everyone else spells it. Although the phonetic pronunciation, according to Ali, is Bodini.
So did he have a box in the military or anything?
You know what? I assumed I knew he was in the Navy. So when I went into this project, like where I'm from, a lot of the guys who were in the Navy boxed while they were in the service. Not the case. He never boxed in the Navy, never boxed as an amateur, never boxed as a professional. According to his son, Drew Brown III, his dad did not have an athletic bone in his body. He said one time they were at a family reunion at Deer Lake, Pennsylvania, where Ali used to train. And they were playing softball, and they had to talk him into playing. And he said he got out there and he didn't even know how to hold a bat. He said, my dad was so uncoordinated and unathletic. You would never believe that he motivated great fighters like Sugar Ray and Muhammad Ali and George Chuvalo and, Quick Tillis, all these guys he trained. His dad, he said the only time I remember my dad ever running was in the Shaft movies when he was running after Richard Roundtree.
So how is it that he became affiliated with, Sugar Ray?
Well, there's a couple stories. Bundini's brother, he had a younger brother who did box. So he would go watch his brother box as an amateur in Florida. And according to some of the family members, he even worked some corners just in his brother's corner as an amateur back when he was younger, before he moved to Harlem. So he did have a little bit of a connection to boxing through his younger brother, who never really made anything out of boxing, didn't turn pro or anything like that. But how he got to know Sugar Ray was through Johnny Honeyboy Bratton, who he met at Sugar Ray's Golden Glove Barbershop. Bundini is this sort of zealot-like character who always pops up at the right place at the right time. And he had a little ratty apartment that was directly above some of the real estate that Sugar Ray Robinson had purchased and developed in Harlem. If you know anything about Sugar Ray, when he first retired, he built a lingerie store. He built a club, a bar, Sugar Ray Dry Cleaners, Sugar Ray Golden Glove Barbershop. And Bundini lived in a little apartment above the Golden Gloves Barbershop in Harlem. He would just hang out in the barbershop, get his hair done, bullshit with the guys, just talking. It was a place to sort of hang out and, have a sense of camaraderie with the guys that would come in. And because it was Sugar Ray's, a lot of fighters came in. A lot of boxers would come in, even though Sugar Ray didn't necessarily hang out there much. One of the guys who came in one day was a guy named Johnny Honeyboy Bratton. He was a former welterweight champion. He had fought Kid Gavilan. He'd fought a bunch of, top fighters of the day. And they got to be sort of friends. And Johnny Bratton brings him to the gym. Bundini likes to tease. He likes to pick. That's one of the things I learned about him. And he would tease Bratton. And he'd say, oh, you're too pretty to be a fighter. You're not a fighter. You're too good looking. You're having scars. You're not a fighter. And apparently, one day Bundini was picking on him, teasing. and Bratton really gave it to his sparring partner. And one of Bratton's handlers, a guy named Norman Henry, said, "Hey man, you need to come to the gym. You make him fight harder." And he started hanging out with Bratton, kind of working his way up that entourage. And Bratton kind of hands him off to Sugar Ray. Those two know each other because they're big name fighters at the time. So it was through Johnny Honeyboy Bratton that Bundini eventually works his way in Sugar Ray Robinson's entourage.
Was it easy to get into the corner? Because there's only so many people allowed, obviously, into the corner for a fight. And with his lack of, boxing experience, because as we touched on, he never boxed as a pro or an amateur. I'm sure there was people were kind of wondering, like, why is this guy in the corner? Because he's
what's funny? That's the first question, people should ask me. No one ever asked me that question. You're the first one, Mike. People always say, they want to talk about float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, and all that stuff. But it is pretty shocking that he does work his way up the ladder. But here's what it is. When he first starts working with Sugar Ray meets him at a steakhouse that's located adjacent to one of his businesses. And he kind of likes Bundini. Bundini kind of raps to him. They have a nice little exchange. And he was like, let's help the guy out. He needs some money. He's got a baby on the way. So he starts out just kind of hanging with Sugar Ray, being what Sugar Ray called an odd jobs man. Run to the store, get me this, do that, get the towels. He was kind of just, Sugar Ray was paying him cash just to help out around the gym. Bundini even babysat his kids. Just stuff like that. He was just doing menial work. But for 7 straight years, he's a part of the team. And by the end of that 7 years, Bundini is invited to Greenwood Lake, New York, where Sugar Ray trained for the second half of his career. And Bundini is there day in and day out. And he starts becoming sort of a motivator, just someone who shadows Sugar Ray on the bag, the speed bag, sparring. And Sugar Ray never brings him to the corner, but Sugar Ray brings him to training camp to help him get ready. And by the end of the 7 years, he's closer to Bundini than any of the people who are still there. So Bundini kind of works his way up the pyramid, up the entourage. And by the end of it, they're best friends. They're extremely close. Now, you got to also remember something else about Sugar Ray, Mike, is that Sugar Ray had his hairdresser in the corner. Sugar Ray was a fly dude. So in between rounds, his hairdresser would fix his hair. So Sugar Ray had this sort of massive entourage. He had all these people. He had a professional golf instructor who traveled with him to give him golf tips. He learned to tap dance. He had a dance coach. Sugar Ray had the entourage of that period. And Bundini was there to be his motivator. You got to keep him on point, keep his spirits up. He wasn't really a court jester. He gets labeled that a lot, but he wasn't really a jokester, to be honest. He was there to kind of keep him motivated, keep him on point. And by the end of that 7 years, those two are very close. And of course, as I'm sure your listeners know, it's Sugar Ray Robinson who recommends Bundini to Ali when he's still Cassius Clay in 1964, right before that Doug Jones fight at Madison Square Garden.
Do you know if Bundini had that up and down relationship with Sugar Ray that he kind of had with Ali?
He did not. That's a great question too. You got to remember though, the circumstances were so different. Sugar Ray Robinson really wasn't much of a political guy. He had a great reputation in the media. He was one of the first pro boxers, not the first, but who was beloved by Black America and white America. He wasn't really political or controversial. He was sort of, he had tap dance on the Ed Sullivan Show, that kind of thing. He was very, he was an easy guy to be around in some ways. Ali's career is tied up with the Vietnam War and the Nation of Islam. And his career is, tied in with the exile and all this political turmoil. Sugar Ray was a pretty humble, not braggadocious guy. Ali was the first athlete to sort of express greatness and bravado and beauty in the way he did. So they were totally different guys. The reason he and Ali had lots of ups and downs were those reasons. Sugar Ray and Bundini got along just fine. He was never fired from Sugar Ray's camp. There was never turmoil. They remained friends until Bundini's death. Sugar Ray outlives Bundini. Of course, he's suffering from dementia and he's not doing well, but he actually outlived Bundini.
Sugar Ray was kind of, if you look at it, ahead of his times because, a lot of people say, boxing's 90% mental, 10% physical. He had Bundini as the hype man, and he also had that psychological thing where you touched on, he'd get his hairdresser to fix his hair. So when he came out for like the 8th or 9th round, his opponent's looking at him and he looks, box fresh. It looks like he's just stepped into the ring.
Right. Let me interrupt real quick. You're completely right. One thing I was able to do through his son, Bundini's son gave me his dad's writings. But when he died, he was trying to write a book, and I have access to those writings. Bundini learned a lot of his philosophies that he gave to Ali from Sugar Ray. And the reason he did the hair thing was when your opponent comes out as 8th round of a tough fight and he still looks great, and his hair is perfect, then you're like, wow, I'm not doing any damage. I can't even mess this guy's hair up. It is psychological. He learned a lot of the psychological stuff from Sugar Ray. Even though Sugar Ray wasn't much of a trash talker, he understood the mental side of boxing. And the hair trick is just one of those things. I think Roberto Duran did that too. I've read that, Ray Arcel would do that with Duran. But, he didn't have a hairdresser in the corner like Sugar Ray did.
So how was it that Bundini came to join forces with Ali? And how hard was it for Sugar Ray to let him go?
Well, here's what you got to remember. Sugar Ray was still fighting. And when Ali turns pro, guess who he asked to be his trainer? Sugar Ray Robinson. And Sugar Ray says, hey, I'm still fighting. I can't train you. He was past his prime, but he was still boxing. Well, next they go to Ali's amateur trainers from Louisville, Kentucky. And if you go back and watch his first pro fight against Tunney Hunsaker, his amateur coaches are his trainers. But if you remember, Ali goes the distance with Hunsaker in that fight. Doesn't necessarily look particularly great for a gold medalist. He's fighting a guy whose day job was a police chief in Fayetteville, West Virginia. So Ali doesn't look super great in his first fight. And then his team at the time said, we maybe need a big name trainer. This guy can be a legendary heavyweight. So they go back to Sugar Ray, and he says no again. So then they start looking for trainers, and they start looking for other. And of course, Archie Moore trains Ali for his second fight. That only lasts one fight because he's very tough on Ali. Well, then Ali's third trainer eventually becomes Angelo Dundee, right? So Ali didn't have a stable trainer for the first sort of year of his professional career. He was kind of bouncing from one trainer to the next. He comes back to Sugar Ray again for a third time. And Sugar Ray says, look, I'm not going to train you, but I've got someone that you can make your training camps go better. Is my right-hand man. He's the guy that keeps me focused. He keeps me motivated. And he's the only guy I've ever met who can out-talk you, Cassius. And he's talking about Bundini. So he has his brother-in-law introduce Bundini to Ali in Ali's hotel room the night before the Doug Jones fight, 1964. And, I'm sure the story. Everyone's heard the story where Bundini accused Ali of being a phony because Ali predicted the rounds he knocked his opponents out in. And, of course, they have their little squabble. And, right from the start, they're arguing. They argue all through their friendship. But eventually they talk it out, and Ali admits that a lot of the trash talk is just talk. It's just a way to psych himself up. And they become fast friends. So Bundini says, if you do get a shot at Liston, you need me in your corner. And Sugar Ray tells him the same thing. And I guess it's a testament to how much Ali respected and admired Sugar Ray. He replaces Rockman, who's his brother. Bundini replaces Rockman in the corner for that very pivotal, crucial Sonny Liston fight. And, of course, during that training camp is where Bundini coins the phrase, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. And the rest is history.
Obviously, in the book, you refer to Bundini as Ali's hype man. Can you just tell us what exactly that is? Because I'm pretty sure it's more than just being a cheerleader.
Absolutely. And that's a point I tried to make in the introduction to the book is the term hype man comes out of hip hop. The original role of a hype man in hip hop was not to be a yes man or a cheerleader. The hype man comes out on stage and gets the crowd ready, gets the crowd pumped up. Then when the headlining artist comes out, he stays on stage with the headlining artist in between songs, in between sets, to keep him up too. So the hype man is out there to keep the headlining artist motivated, focused, and into the show. And, so many people have referred to Bundini as a hype man, folks who are from the hip hop generation, because the role of a hype man, as it was originally crafted in the early days of hip hop in the early 80s, is sort of what Bundini was doing for Ali. And not only was he doing that, he was also coming up with much of the rhymes. For as great as Ali was, he was a better fighter than a poet. A lot of those rhymes were Bundini's rhymes, float like a butterfly being the most famous. And, I wanted to make a point to the hip hop generation that, Bundini was more than a hype man in the negative sense of the term, but he also was sort of the archetype for the hype man that 2 decades later shows up in hip hop, because, Bundini is sort of synonymous with that concept. You watch, we were talking about this the other day in an interview. You watch like political stuff and they'll talk about vice presidents as hype men. They'll say, oh yeah, that's Obama's Bundini, or that's, Joe Biden's Bundini, or whoever. And I think Bundini's name has become synonymous with the term. So I wanted to resurrect that component of his identity. I wanted people to realize that he was more than a cheerleader, court jester, certainly wasn't a yes man. If he was a yes man, he wouldn't have been fired so much. He was fired often, it sounds like.
It was Bundini that came up with the crazy persona for the Sonny Liston fight.
That was his idea, yeah.
And do you know why he did that? Why he told Ali to act like such a madman?
Yeah, he had some of that stuff is in his personal writing. Some of the stuff his son would tell me, because him and his dad, he always classified that as his dad's best work, because he said Ali, a lot of people thought Liston was going to destroy him in 1 or 2 rounds. And Bundini gave him the confidence, the swagger, the focus to sort of believe he could do it. All fighters doubt. All fighters have fear. And his dad had taught him down in Florida at the 5th Street Gym, the only way to scare someone in prison, the tough guy, is the crazy guy. You're not going to out-tough the tough guy. Sonny Liston was a gangster. Sonny Liston was from the streets. Ali wanted no part of Liston in the streets. But he said, we can convince him you're crazy. You're a nut. And that even scares the tough guy. You can't out-tough the tough guy, but you can get him worried. And boy, did they do a great job. If you read Freddie Pacheco's books and you read, some of the stuff Angelo Dundee has written, those guys definitely were worried about the champ, because he was acting like a lunatic during those pre-fight weigh-in and all that stuff. And you got to remember too, back in those days, the weigh-in was not a publicity thing. Only the very hardcore boxing media went. A weigh-in to a heavyweight championship is pretty much pointless. No one has to make weight.
Yeah.
And that was the first heavyweight weigh-in with all the crazy theatrics. Now today, you'll never see a weigh-in or a press conference that doesn't have that. That's how you sell fights. And that comes from Bundini's strategy for the Liston fight. I mean, they went in there and acted like lunatics. And part of the act was Bundini would pretend to pull him back and Ali would break free, and Bundini would pretend, and they had rehearsed it. They had practiced it.
Bundini actually worked with Ali with no contract. Is that right?
Yeah, and the same thing with Sugar Ray. Basically, when he signed on with Sugar Ray, he said, pay me what you think I'm worth. And after the fight was over and he cashed the check, he would break off some money for Bundini. Now, of course, when he was a member of Sugar Ray's entourage, he was eating for free, getting to travel, staying in nice hotels. So there were perks, but he never signed a contract with Sugar Ray or Ali. And that was essentially the same agreement. If Bundini had good representation, if he had a lawyer and a manager, that would have never happened. He would have taken care of himself a little better than that. But it was a handshake agreement with both guys, and they would pay him after the fight. And of course, he got to be a part of Ali's historic entourage as well, which, I don't know, maybe is the most famous, even more famous than Sugar Ray's.
Do you know if Bundini ever wanted more credit for obviously the famous phrases? Because, I'm sat here with a T-shirt which looked like a butterfly, sting like a bee. So do you know if that ever got between Ali and Bundini?
Not at all. I actually don't think that was ever a tiff. And here's why. Ali never wanted to take credit for that. Ali helped Bundini get that trademarked. And Bundini got the money off Float Like a Butterfly, Sting Like a Bee. And also during training camp, especially in Deer Lake, Pennsylvania, they would sell Float Like a Butterfly, Sting Like a Bee T-shirts and buttons and hats and posters. And that was another way for Bundini to make a little bit of money. So his son, who was a teenager at the time, would, when he wasn't in school, go up to Deer Lake and sell that stuff. So no, I really don't think that was ever a tiff between them. Their big arguments were usually about Bundini's reputation with the Nation of Islam. He was not a poster boy for the Nation of Islam. He was a drinker. He liked to party. He was someone who had a white wife who she was Jewish. Her parents were Russian immigrants who were Orthodox Jews. He wore a Star of David necklace in the corner. That was stuff that irked the Nation of Islam. They didn't think Bundini was a good representation of their image and their teachings. And of course, Bundini liked to drink. He liked to have fun. And Bundini had to hide his drinking from Muhammad because Muhammad lived a clean life in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
So the tiffs were about other things, never about credit for that poem, or never for credit. Ali was very gracious in giving Bundini credit for helping him and being a part of the entourage. He would always bring him out for the cameras. He was in the background, but in a way he wasn't, right? They were doing that routine together. So, I don't think that in particular was ever a problem. It was usually the other stuff.
He allowed him to do a little side hustle of selling signed memorabilia, right?
That was a big thing that a lot of folks wanted to talk to me about. So a lot of people who weren't a part of the entourage would say to me, Bundini would sell Ali's trunks. He would sell hand wraps. He would sell Ali T-shirts that Ali trained in. He would do that stuff to the side. And, some people would say to me that seems exploitive, or that seems, it seems, wrong. But, I talked to Kalia Ali, who was his wife during that time period. And I said, Kalia, did the champ know that he did that? And she said, of course he knew. And she said, Ali told me once, I would rather him do that than ask me for money. Mm. So, he said, as long as I have a pair of trunks to wear tomorrow in training, I don't care what he does with them. So they were aware that Bundini did that. I don't think that was hidden. I don't think that was subversive. I think, Bundini didn't have a formal education. He didn't make the huge money that Ali made. I think Ali was cool with him selling trunks or selling memorabilia on the side. I don't think that was ever a problem. Anyone who was on the inside, and Angelo Dundee's son Jim said the same thing to me. We all knew about it. No one cared about it. Wasn't an issue with the champ. Champ was not materialistic. Ali wasn't great with money either. He would just give it away. And he gave a lot to Bundini. He took care of Bundini.
Who did you actually get to speak to for the research for the book? And was there anybody that you would have liked to speak to?
Yeah, I talked to almost everyone I could talk to. I talked to Kalia Ali. I talked to Larry Holmes. I talked to George Foreman. Talked to Angelo's son. I talked to all the Brown family who was still alive, who knew him. I talked to some of the Palestine family, Bundini's wife. Of course, my biggest relationship was with Bundini's son. I talked to his childhood friends. I talked to folks at Deer Lake who met Bundini when he trained there. I talked to Jerry Cooney, Tim Witherspoon, James Quick Tillis, who Bundini trained for a couple fights. All those folks that you would expect to talk to. The only person who turned me down was Don King. I'll just leave it at that. I'll just say that's the only person who turned me down was Don.
Did anybody say, kind of push back against you and you're saying you're actually taking credit away from Ali?
Not at all. And you know what? That's how I know how much these two men loved each other. That George Foreman, all I had to do was send him an email, and the next day we were on the phone. He said, boy, the champ would have loved Bundini getting his own book. He said he would have loved Bundini getting his day in the sun. Same thing Larry Holmes said, Tim Withers, all these guys who knew Bundini loved him and admired him and got a kick out of him. James Quick Tillis was giving me phone numbers and helping me out. Anything he could do to help me get more people, more interviews. They loved him so much. And maybe it's they loved Ali so much. I don't know. But they really wanted me to get everything I could get. Everyone was so helpful. And even Ali's biographers, Jonathan Agg, Thomas Hauser, all these guys, they were so helpful and nice to me. Everybody wanted Bundini to get his story told the right way. There was nobody other than Mr. King who was not willing to help me. I just say that.
One thing I found that, obviously, after reading the book and doing research for the interview today, I went back and watched some of the old fights, is I started to notice how much more of an influence Bundini had on the fights and how loud he was. You could hear him on the TV.
Now, listen, I went back and watched every fight of Ali's career. And, of course, I grew up watching those fights. But I watched them again only to look for Bundini. And I forgot this. So many times NBC would put a little box in the corner of the screen where you could watch Bundini watch the fight. And there were several times where Howard Cosell would say, ladies and gentlemen, we do not have Bundini mic'd up. That's how loud he's yelling right now. And, later in life, Freddie Pacheco would talk about that when he was a play-by-play guy for Showtime. He would talk about Bundini giving him, ear trouble because he screamed in his ear the whole time. Bundini was the loudest, most dominating voice in Ali's corner. And he was always the first one in the ring to hug the champ and pick him up. And you go back to, the Liston fight and all in the Rumble in the Jungle. It's Bundini who's in there first. It was Bundini who was the loudest voice. And, when I interviewed Angelo Dundee's son, I assumed that maybe, he got on Angelo's nerves. And he swore to me, he said, Dad got a kick out of him. Dad loved him. He said they would squabble, but he said, he never said, shut up, Bundini, or anything. He said they would have their tiffs or whatever, but it would be over immediately. He recognized that Bundini charged Ali's batteries, that he did something good for the champ.
Do you think it's the hype man role is like forgotten about in the boxing world now?
Yeah. I mean, everyone says, who would be the Bundini today? There is no Bundini today. And Tim Witherspoon, who I interviewed, said this to me. There was never really a Bundini before Drew Bundini Brown. There has never been one since. I mean, Mike Tyson had that character at the second half of his career, Crocodile, who would bark on the way to the ring and stuff. But I don't know if you compare him to Bundini. Deontay had a personal hype man for a while. I mean, there's been a couple, but not someone who was such a part of the show as Bundini was. I think we forget he was a movie star. He was in all those Shaft movies. He had his own sort of celebrity too. He was in The Color Purple with Whoopi Goldberg and Oprah. He was in a couple B-level movies too. Bundini was kind of famous on his own a little bit. You remember he was well known in boxing before he met Ali. So he kind of had his own star power in some ways. He was more than just a lackey to the Ali entourage.
What kind of role did religion play in Bundini's life?
Man, that was my favorite thing to write about, is that all he wanted to talk about was religion. And as I dug through his personal writings, all he wrote about was God. He married a Jewish woman. So in some ways, he gets labeled a Jewish man. And his son was raised a Jewish man. He had a bar mitzvah. He went to Israel. Like his son was raised in the faith. But Bundini was sort of this spiritual guy. And his nickname for God was Shorty. And his concept of God was a God who was for the little guy, the least, and a personal God who you could talk to all on your own. And no matter what happened in life, God had your back. Even when it was bad, God was teaching you a lesson, and it was going to end up going your way at the end. He had this strong belief in God. He loved to talk about God. He loved to pray. He loved to go to religious ceremonies. He would go to mosques, synagogues. He would go to Baptist churches. He loved taking his son to religious ceremonies. He loved to pray with people. His spirituality was fascinating to me. And I think he and Ali, despite having different religious traditions, had a similar idea of God. That line we hear of Ali after the Liston fight, I talk to God every day. If God's with me, no one can be against me. That's a Bundini line. That's the stuff Bundini was feeding him. And it was the stuff Bundini was feeding him in Zaire as he got ready for George Foreman. This is God's act, is what he called the fight. God's ordained this to happen. All the troubles you went through, exile, the losses to Frazier and Norton, the broken jaw, all of that was a trial. And God's going to reward you by upsetting the unbeatable George Foreman. That was the kind of stuff he was feeding him and training. This is God's act. The Shorty's on your side, and you could see where you go into battle. That's not a bad thing to hear, to feel like you're going there to fight these legends, these lions, and God is on your side. It's going to come your way because Shorty picked you to be the greatest of all time. And,
you touched.
That's what he brought to the table.
Yeah, like you touched on earlier in the interview, sometimes the fights, won or lost in the locker room.
Oh, you fight a guy like George Foreman or Mike Tyson or Sonny Liston, a lot of their opponents are beat before the bell rings. And I used to watch that in my dad's gym. We would have guys who were built like Greek gods. I mean, just perfect bodies and muscular and just look like the guy you'd never want to get in there with. And they would have no confidence by the time the bell rang. And some of it's nerves. Some of it's what you got underneath the hood. But, you need someone to get your mind ready to fight. And in some ways, you look at the Deontay Wilder-Tyson Fury fight. Wilder clearly was not in a positive mindset before that fight. He looked beaten. He looked beaten in the first round. You got to give Fury all the credit in the world for that. But he didn't look mentally ready for that fight for whatever reason. I'm not blaming the costume or any of that stuff. But the mental side of it is so important. You look at Michael Spinks when he got in the ring against Tyson. You could just see on his face he was a beaten man. You could see on his face he knew he was not going to win the fight. And, Ali needed that narrative. He was a storyteller. He had a big imagination. The idea that God had ordained this, and it was happening in Africa, the homeland of his people. It was all coming together to create this moment in history. Ali liked that idea. He liked that narrative. He had a big imagination, and so did Bundini.
when Ali and Bundini had the squabbles and they broke up, several times and got back together, was it Ali's idea to bring them back in or Dundee's?
Never Dundee's. Usually Gene Kilroy. Gene Kilroy was Ali's business manager, and I interviewed him several times for the book, and we become friends. Gene said, Ali would fire him over whatever. And he said we would watch him in training camp, and Ali would not be exerting the same amount of energy, cutting corners. Ali could sometimes fight down to his opponents. If you look at his career, he'd fight a guy who he should really dominate, and sometimes just lay on the ropes and do whatever. And they would get nervous and go, man, whatever it was Bundini gave him, we need it back. And Gene told me they would wait for Ali to be in a good mood. And they would say, champ, man, don't you think it's quiet? Don't you think we ought to give Bundini a second? I worry about Bundini. I heard he's doing bad. And they would kind of talk Ali into doing it. And they said Ali would bring him back, and he said it would just light his fire again. Bundini would, be right back doing it like nothing ever happened. But, if you look at some of the fights where Bundini didn't come to training camp, they're some of the heaviest weights of Ali's career. Now, that's a fact. I mean, that's a fact. He came in heavy against, the Spinks in the first fight. He came in heavy against Norton in the first fight. Both of those training camps, Bundini was not there. So, I mean, there's something to it. When his son first said that to me, I thought, oh, he's being biased. It's his dad. You go back and look at the tape. He came in a little pudgy.
I thought it was good that you kind of, told the truth and kind of set the record straight about the supposedly Bundini selling one of Ali's championships. Yeah,
I mean, look, here's what it was a bad thing that happened. No, I'm not apologizing for Bundini at all. What happened was the Nation of Islam was very upset with Bundini. He was doing a lot of stuff that was not in line with their teachings. Let's just say it that way. And they told Ali, either he cleans up his act or he's out. It wasn't that Ali told him to convert to Islam or anything like that. That wasn't what happened. What happened was Bundini was not a good spokesperson in Ali's corner. So Ali fired him. And when he fired him, at the time, Bundini was in possession of his belt. Ali had given it to him after the upset against Sonny Liston. Ali had said to him, this is my gift to you. He gave the belt to Bundini Brown. And because Ali fired him and didn't pay him for the rematch, Bundini took a hammer and beat it up and tried to some people have said he's tried to take the stones. There were apparently stones, or he tried to, he defaced the belt in some way and tried to pawn it. And once he found out the belt really wasn't worth much other than the fact that it was Ali's belt, Ali didn't want him back after that. It was destroyed. It was mangled. So, Ali did let him go. And I think for 7 fights, they weren't together. And the compound thing to make things worse, Bundini works George Chuvalo's corner against Ali, sort of to get him back. And Chuvalo gave him a good fight that night. He was ready. At the time, it was probably Ali's toughest fight. But yeah, that did happen. It wasn't, but in the movies and in some of the documentaries, it's like Bundini had stole the belt, or Bundini had pawned it behind his back when they were friends. It wasn't like that. They were really beefing at the time. They were not talking to each other. He was very mad over not being paid for the Liston rematch. He had spent time away from his family in training camp, and then felt very, he felt like, Ali had, done a disservice to him. So he did damage the belt and then tried to give it back to him, and Ali didn't want it.
Obviously, you got to know the family really well. Jamie Foxx's portrayal of Bundini in the Ali movie, where they insinuate that he was a heroin addict. Yeah. How did the family take to that?
It was very traumatic to his son, and the family were so hurt because they went to the theater excited, and they had bragged for months. Jamie Foxx is playing Bundini. They were so happy to go see the movie. But of course, they weren't consulted. They, no one from the movie had reached out to them to help with Jamie Foxx. Drew had wanted to do that because Drew had helped his father on the Shaft movies. He wanted to be a consultant in the movie, and they were left out in the cold. Look, Bundini did sell the belt, but it was because of the rift between the Nation of Islam. He did do that. In the movie, they make him a heroin addict who sells it for heroin money. That is the furthest thing from the truth. And every single person I talked to swore to me Bundini was not a junkie. Now, he was an alcoholic, and he smoked marijuana. Not around the champ, but he did smoke marijuana. He wasn't a heroin addict. He'd never used heroin in his life. They felt like the movie took too many creative liberties. They took it too far.
During your research, was there anything that surprised you?
Yeah, a lot of things surprised me. The biggest surprise was the relationship Bundini had with George Foreman. When I interviewed Foreman, I assumed, that the only relationship they had was the Rumble in the Jungle. Wrong. They were friends years before the Rumble in the Jungle. And in my book, I talk about this. They met while Ali was in exile, and they struck up a friendship and started hanging out together. And Ali actually fired Bundini, quote unquote, because he was there with Big George for when George beat Joe Frazier. And they were on TV together, hugging and palling around. And Ali, I suppose you could say, he got jealous. He was pissed. And he fired Bundini, told him, don't come around me anymore. Go hang out with George. So they were friends. So when the Rumble in the Jungle happens, there's like this friendship triangle where, Bundini and George are buddies and have been for about 5 years. And for Ali, he wants Bundini there on his side. So Bundini's kind of caught in the middle. I had no idea that their friendship lasted so long. And of course, years later, when George is about to make his comeback, he calls Bundini and asks him to be in the corner. That never happens. It doesn't happen. But Angelo works the corner instead. But, they were great friends. And I never had any idea that George Foreman and Bundini had a friendship. So it was fun to write about that because I think most boxing folks are not aware of that friendship.
Was there any wild stories that didn't make the book?
Certainly. Look, here's the thing. We all know Bundini was a wild guy, right? We all know Bundini liked to party. We all know Bundini was the life of the party. Certainly, he had lots of lady friends. Let's say it that way. Some of them were kind of famous. And some of them were, I didn't want to put their names in the book because, this is not TMZ. This is not scandalous. Didn't really add much to the story. But, one of the things we talked about, which has been written about, but, I don't think explored in any length, is that he did have a child with Ruth Brown, R&B singer at the time. They used to call her Miss R&B. So he was someone who, definitely got around, definitely had lots of famous lady friends. Let's say it that way.
Was there anything whilst you were doing the research that gave you the impression that his life was always going to take this path?
That's a good question. I do think one thing I uncovered is that boxing was a part of his life from a young age in some form or fashion. His best childhood memory was listening to the Joe Louis Max Schmeling fight with his father. His father was a really stern man. His father was tough. His father hunted alligators and cut their hides. He worked on the railroad. His father fought in the army. So he's like this really tough guy. And it was the first time he ever saw his dad cry with happiness when Joe Louis beat the Nazi. And as a kid, I think that made some kind of indelible impact on him. He remembered what Joe Louis had done to his father. So I think right then, at that moment, boxing starts to be an idea in his head. Boxing's something magic. Boxing's something great. Boxing brings races together. It brings people together. And of course, Joe Louis and Bundini become friends later on in life, that they get to know each other. So I think that's one thing I didn't anticipate, is that boxing was always sort of around him. His younger brother was an amateur boxer. He'd worked his corner. And the next corner he works is Ali Liston. So, he goes from working his brother's corner in Sanford, Florida in an amateur fight at an armory to, one of the biggest heavyweight championships ever. So I don't know if it was Shorty or what it was, but, boxing was always in his environment in some form or fashion.
Do you think he was so loud and outlandish and motivating, but deep down he was maybe depressed?
No, I think he did battle depression. Yes. He battled his addiction, which he tried so hard to fight and to get over. But alcoholism had a big problem. When he was training with the champ, he was clean and he was focused. But in between fights, he struggled. When Ali's career started to wind down and the fights became less and less, he struggled really bad. Yeah, he had some personal demons. He was abandoned by his mother when he was only in the second grade. His dad was verbally and physically abusive to him. He had a rocky marriage that, at a time was extremely taboo. For a black man to be married to a white Jewish woman was very controversial. He had to deal with the racism and all the stuff that went with that. Yeah, he had some demons. He had some stuff that maybe he didn't work out in the most positive ways. And I think a lot of that shows up with his drinking problem.
In his role in the sports world, he also dabbled in, obviously, film and arts. And what did you learn about that? Because he tried to bring out a motivational book.
Yeah, he did. The thing about Bundini that was interesting was that he couldn't read or write at an adult level. He could read and write at a very basic level, probably like a second or third grade student. So he couldn't read the script to Shaft. So he and his son would practice in the kitchen. His son would read the lines to him and he would memorize them. And for someone who couldn't even read the script, who had never been taught acting, who had never been given an acting coach, what a fantastic performance. I think in that movie, if you want to look at Shaft, he's as good of an actor as anyone else. You'd never dream he wasn't an actor. And there are a lot of my friends who are in the hip hop world who they didn't realize Bundini was a boxing guy. They just knew him from the Shaft movies. They knew him as Willie, the gangster, and he plays Shaft's sidekick in the sequel. I think for someone who had the background he had and the limited resources he had he had an agent and some good people around him, he could have made a film career. Steven Spielberg doesn't call you unless you have some kind of presence on the screen. Steven Spielberg doesn't need a celebrity cameo. You know what I mean? He already had Oprah and Whoopi Goldberg in that movie. So that tells you everything you need to know. He had a commanding presence. He was charismatic. He was good with his words. He was a handsome guy. He was, stylish. He was just, he begged your attention. You couldn't look away from him. And I think that shows up in his film career, even though it was brief.
Just imagine how big he would be today with the power of social media. It's
so sad. And I had a conversation with his son one day, and he said, it's sad that my father didn't get to follow Freddie Pacheco into broadcasting. Because, Freddie Pacheco had a whole career of Showtime. A lot of people didn't know he was Ali's fight doctor. And he was a hell of a good commentator. Teddy Atlas, I think, is very interesting. In his work he did for ESPN. Emmanuel Stewart. There's a lot of these great boxing trainers who make it as broadcasters. And Bundini's son said to me, you would have had more fun watching my dad watch the fight than you would have just watching the fight. He would have had you laughing. He would have had you in stitches. And I agree with him. His dad was so funny and charismatic. It is a shame he couldn't have picked up a microphone. And, the English language was his weapon. He would have been fantastic on TV. If you could have kept him straight and kept him, disciplined, he would have been one hell of a funny broadcaster. He would have been part of the show, and you would have loved it. And it's a shame that didn't get to happen.
What kind of father was Bundini?
He was a great father in some ways, and then, of course, he had his problems in others. He was absent in some ways because he was always on the road with Ali, traveling here and there, and he was away a lot at training camp, and his career was dedicated to Ali, to be by his side pretty much 24/7. So yeah, his son missed his father's presence. His dad had a revolving door of girlfriends. He always had these new girlfriends around and stuff. So he made a lot of the mistakes that fathers make when the family split. But at the same time, he loved his son. You'll never meet a more proud father. If you go back and watch those interviews, he's always talking about my son, the jet pilot, my son, this. He brags about his son so much, wrote about his son, loved his son. So, in some ways, he was a fantastic father. And he gave his son so many wonderful life lessons and philosophies to live by. And I think that shows in his son's life. His son was a first-generation college graduate, college basketball star, a Navy jet pilot, a motivational speaker, just like his daddy. And Drew's children, Bundini's grandchildren, went on to do wonderful things in life. So from the root to the fruit was his phrase. I think if you look, his teachings went on and they're still alive today in the Brown family. They went on to do amazing things even after his death.
Do you think it's too strong to say that Bundini changed, the world of pop culture?
No, I think he absolutely did. And one of my motivations for writing the book is not to redeem his reputation. He was a flawed human being like you are and I am. He made mistakes and he made them again and again. But the truth is, Drew Bundini Brown changed boxing history. He changed what the weigh-in looks like. He changed the way athletes talk. Today, every athlete talks like Muhammad Ali, or most do. He changed sports, and a lot of that was Bundini. And he changed pop culture, too. I think Drew Bundini Brown is a pre-hip-hop icon, and he deserves to be put down in hip-hop history as someone who helped create the avenue for hip-hop culture. Ali, of course, being a major figure in leading us toward hip-hop.
Were Bundini and Ali Sugar Ray and George Foreman, were they all close at the time of his death?
Yeah, here's the thing though. At the time of his death, he was living in Los Angeles, and he was pretty much still hanging out with Ali and Howard Bingham and all those guys, Victor Solano, all the Ali's crew. Ali was starting to feel the effects of Parkinson's. He was starting to get sick. He was starting to slow down. The speech was starting to be affected. I think a lot of Bundini's depression came from seeing the champ in his physical state, and Ali couldn't really look after him, and take care of him anymore because he couldn't really take care of himself. So Bundini was going to the gym with him and helping Ali with his training. They were trying to combat the effects of Parkinson's. So Bundini was with him at the gym. But Ali was starting to get sick, and Ali was having some financial problems, and he was having marital problems with Veronica Porsche at the time. And Bundini was starting to hit the bottle pretty hard. And things were not good for Bundini there at the end. I won't lie to you. He still had a phone relationship with George Foreman. They talked to each other on the phone every little bit. But George told me, he was very honest. He said the last time I saw him, he didn't look healthy.
Right.
He could tell he was down on it. It was bad times.
What was your favorite motivational or inspiring quote?
Okay, that's a good one. He had a phrase that he would use with Ali in the morning. So one of Bundini's jobs was he would wake Ali up for road work. You got to think that's 5 o'clock in the morning. So you got to wake him up, And he said he would wake him up in full character, and he would call it getting the gas, filling the gas tank. And he would say, nobody sees this, champ. Everybody sees, but only a few know. The fight's won right here at 5 o'clock in the morning. It's how are you going to get out of bed? How are you going to roll out of bed in the morning like a champion or like a contender or like the greatest to ever do it? And he would start on him right from the start. And I think it is an interesting concept. Will you have the gas tank? Will it be full in the 15th round? It does start with you getting out of bed. It starts with how you get out of bed. And I think that lesson applies to every job in every walk of life. Whether you're a father or you're a teacher or I don't care what you are. You could be the garbage man. How are you getting out of bed? What's the attitude you're bringing to the world when you walk outside? And that's getting the gas. You're going to get out of the bed and get the gas, or you're going to drag your feet. And you could see where that would, that philosophy is a good one. It's a positive philosophy. And, that was his first thing he would say to champ. Time to get the gas, champ. We got to get the gas, champ. You're going to have a full tank and they're going to be on E. That's what he would tell Ali.
I like that one.
That's a good one.
Yeah. You touched on that you got to, go through and read some of his writings.
Mm-hmm.
How much of those are in the book? And do you think we'll see maybe, a second book, a documentary, or maybe even a movie about his life?
Well, we didn't put a lot of it in, to be honest. It informed a lot of the dialogue. And, we would have a scene and, his son would talk to me about it. And I would talk to the other people who were there if I could. And sometimes if we struggled with the dialogue, we would take it out of his writing. So it was at least his words. It was at least in his language. But we have tons of stuff. And no, we didn't put it in the book because it's a pretty big book. It's massive. And we wanted to put in as many pictures as we possibly could. Because we had his son gave us a bunch of unpublished photographs from family albums and that kind of stuff. So we wanted to cram it full of pictures, and we wanted to tell every story we could. So we didn't put in a lot of the writings, some of his poetry, some of that stuff, but we did use it in other ways. We created a mini documentary for the book that we put out on Ring Magazine's website and on YouTube. It's a 20-minute documentary, featured some unreleased footage. Bundini's son joins me in narrating the piece just to kind of reintroduce him to people and get a sense of like who this man was if you weren't a boxing aficionado. We felt like we had to reintroduce him to the world. But we do still have a lot of stuff. And, there's been some interest in a documentary, and there's been some interest in talking about a screenplay. Who knows? The book came out August 25th. So, we're still kind of early on. We'll let Shorty work all that out. We'll see. I would love to be a part of it. We'll see what happens.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed.
I hope so.
I mean, the book is amazing. You don't have to be a boxing fan to enjoy it. Would you agree?
I think that's what I'm most proud of, is that a lot of the folks who are friends of mine, acquaintances of mine, or just folks that I know have read the book and loved it, who are not boxing fans and had no idea who was going to win those fights. Now, for someone like yourself, when I get to the Rumble in the Jungle, I'm not going to surprise you about the fight. You already know what happens. You've watched it a million times. So what I had to do is tell the stories through Bundini's eyes. Tell them in a way you haven't never heard them told, because you probably knew who won every single fight in the book. A lot of my friends who don't follow boxing were super into it because of the father-son story. They were into it because of the philosophies, the history, the Vietnam War, the Nation of Islam, Jim Crow South in Florida, all the stuff that sort of historicized the book. They were just as interested in as the fight stuff. So if anyone wants to say to me, this isn't a boxing book, that doesn't hurt my feelings at all. I think that's fantastic. It's the story of an extraordinary American life, a guy who wasn't given very many advantages in life and made the best out of it. He's a fighter too, just not in the ring.
Any more books lined up, Todd?
Yeah, I am pretty far along with a book called Beatboxing, How Hip Hop Changed the Fight Game. We've been working on it for about 10 months, 11 months now. It's going to tell the story of hip hop's connections to professional boxing. So for the last, 10 months, I've been interviewing rappers about boxing, and I've been interviewing boxers about rap and talking about the various ways in which those cultures overlap. And I guess in some ways I was sparked by the Bundini book to pursue this research. Of course, the two big loves in my life have always been hip hop and boxing. And, when I met Grandmaster Flash, we argued for 20 minutes over who was going to win Pacquiao Mayweather. I'm at the dinner table arguing with the great Grandmaster Flash. He told me Pacquiao was going to knock out Floyd, and I couldn't let it go. I was like, come on now. I love you, Flash, but I think you may be wishfully thinking there.
Including all of the research, how long was it to finish Bundini?
It took me about 14 months. I wish I could have had even more time, but, so many members of the Ali entourage aren't here anymore. And I talked to almost everyone I could possibly talk to. And we sent it out to the readers after 14 months, I think, and started getting, advanced readers to critique it and look at it. Beatboxing is far along. It is far along. I've met some really cool people, some really interesting folks in hip hop and boxing talking. I just finished an interview with Bernard Hopkins the other day, who has deep hip hop roots too in Philadelphia. So I'm getting to talk to a lot of my boyhood heroes in rap and boxing. It's been an amazing experience. I'm super blessed.
It sounds terrible.
Yeah, I know, right? It's coming out. I think the schedule is November of 2021 for Beatboxing. It's coming out through Hamilcar, the same guys who did Bundini. They brought me back for another book, and I'm very thankful for that. They're doing amazing stuff in boxing publications. They have a Hector Camacho book that's coming out October 20th. That is, I got an advance copy, and I can't put it down. It's really cool.
In doing the research, I think I'm right in saying you actually read the book to Bundini's son before it was released.
Yeah, you know what? They didn't ask me to do that. I did that on my own. I flew down to Atlanta and opened my laptop, and I read every single word to his son face to face, because, I wrote about some tough times. I wrote about some stuff that doesn't make his father look like a saint, but I wanted him to hear it out of my voice. And I wanted to give him that respect and say, look, me and you were going to experience this together first before I give it to the world. And it meant a lot to him. And, he didn't pull punches. He didn't, he didn't ask me to change the negative stuff. He didn't ask me to, hide this or hide that. He gave me pretty much creative freedom from the start. But I thought as a man, I owed that to him. It was his daddy. And, I wanted to make him proud and do his dad justice. And if there was anything in there that I mixed up on accident, I wanted him to be able to tell me before it was too late. So we went down there to Atlanta, and I read it to him. It took us 3 days to read it. It's a big book. And he cried and laughed, and we hugged, and it was, we had a lot of fun. I'll never forget that as long as I live.
How hard and emotional was that for you to read?
I think I cried too, to be honest. Yeah, it was emotional to me, because I can tell you this. I gave this book everything I had. And I've written 3 books prior to Beatboxing. And each book you love in a different way. But this one was so important. And I really wanted to get it right for boxing history and for Bundini and for the champ too. So I gave it everything I had, complete, total focus and dedication. I wrote 6 hours a day, research, call. My whole life was Bundini. I was dreaming about Bundini. I'm not kidding. I was dreaming about him. And I gave it everything I had. And that was sort of how we ended. I flew down there one more time and read it to him face to face. And I'm glad I did that. I think it was the right thing to do.
Obviously, you're a big boxing nut like myself. And, before I let you go, we've got a big fight next week.
I can't wait.
Teofimo Lopez against Lomachenko. How do you see that one going, Todd?
Yeah, I'm gonna tell you a story. I live in New York, so I get to go to a lot of the fights there at the Garden or Barclays. So I was at the Terrence Crawford fight a couple years ago when Teofimo was on the undercard. I can't remember which Crawford fight it was. But anyways, Teofimo was like the third or fourth fight. He was just a newbie, you know. This is back in like 2018, 17. And I remember he knocked this guy out in the first round, did his backflip and everything. And I pulled out my phone and I thought, I got to write this guy's name down because I'd never heard of Teofimo Lopez. You know, he wasn't an Olympian. And I wrote his name down and I thought, I got to follow this guy. He's signed the top rank. He got to be something special. And I've kind of followed him ever since I watched him that night. And I think he has a little something special that is going to create some real fireworks. You can't say enough great things about Vasily Lomachenko. I mean, two-time gold medalist. He's the Matrix. He's one of the most unbelievable boxers in the game. You could argue he's pound for pound. I think I'm going to go out on a limb, though. I think we're going to see a changing of the guard next week. I think we're going to see a new boxing superstar. I think Teofimo is going to pull it out. I just have a gut feeling. I'm not thinking with my brain. I'm thinking with my heart, perhaps. But just seeing him in person and following his career, I just think there's something a little extra there, something special. If I had to put money down, I think I'm gonna go with Teofimo. I think he's going to pull the upset.
A passing of the torch, as they say.
Yeah, and now a lot of people comparing this fight to Canelo versus Mayweather, and that's a great analogy. But let's not forget, Canelo was not ready for that fight. Floyd schooled him. It wasn't a majority decision or whatever they said it was. Floyd won almost every round of that fight. At least won 9 rounds out of the fight. But Canelo still went on to become a great fighter, pound-for-pound fighter, and a superstar. So maybe that's what we see. Maybe we see Lomachenko outbox him, and then Teofimo still goes on to do all the great things I think he's going to do. I don't know. I think we're going to see an upset. I think we're going to see the changing of the guard. And I wouldn't be shocked if it wasn't a thrilling victory. Something really impressive. This is my gut feeling.
I would say it's probably the biggest 50-50 fight of 2020. So, I'm glad with the coronavirus going on that we even managed to see it.
You know what? Boxing came back last summer, but we weren't seeing real top boxing. We weren't seeing A-level fighter versus A-level fighter. This is the best fight since Wilder Fury, and it might even be better. I think it will be a better fight, actually. I think it is a better fight. Maybe not as hyped, and the heavyweights get hyped in a different kind of way. I just have a gut feeling I think Teofimo is going to win the fight. And I have all the respect in the world for Lomachenko, and he may go out there and box and look great and do what Floyd did to Canelo a while back. I don't know. I just have a gut feeling I think we're going to see something special. Probably a kind of performance that'll turn Teofimo into a star, I think.
I can't wait. I can't wait for it.
Boxing can't lose that night. But it's going to be an exciting fight. And if you love boxing, there's no way you're not tuning into that one.
All right, so I just want to say thanks again for your time today. The floor is yours if you want to obviously tell people where they can find you on all of your social media handles and your books.
Yeah, as far as the book goes, anywhere books are sold online, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, you can get it to your indie bookstores and all that stuff. Available in the UK, all across the US. So, we're easy to find. Bundini, Don't Believe the Hype. Google it, it'll pop right up. As far as my social media stuff, I'm on Twitter, Instagram, all that stuff. You can look me up and interact with me. I love hearing back from fans. It's a lot of fun.
Awesome. Thanks, Todd. Obviously, you can find us at The Last Round 12 on Instagram and Twitter, and we'll be back with episode 100 with my co-host, Danny Z. This is The Last Round.
Thanks for supporting and listening to the show. Follow us at The Last Round 12 on social media. Rate, review, and subscribe. This is The Last Round Podcast.